The sound of metal scraping against my cabin lock at 2 in the morning jolted me awake, and when I peered out the window, there she was, Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, standing on my porch with a shiny brass master key that she jabbed into my lock like she was opening a vending machine, only to have the thing snap in half with a loud ping that echoed across the lake. The porch light I had rigged to flash like a camera went off at that exact moment, blinding her and triggering the motion-activated recording system I had installed, which barked out through a speaker, "Unauthorized access detected, law enforcement notified." She staggered back, clutching her purse, and tripped over the welcome mat while the whole fiasco was caught on camera. The best part? My neighbor across the water had his telescope out and saw the entire performance, calling me moments later, laughing so hard he could barely get the words out. Karen scrambled off my porch, her high heels sinking into the gravel as she hissed something about community compliance rights, but the broken half of her master key lay glittering on my doormat like a piece of damning evidence waiting to be bagged. That single failed intrusion was the spark that set everything ablaze, because when I picked up that broken key and turned it in my hand, I knew two things immediately. 1. Karen had just crossed into criminal territory, and 2. I wasn't just going to stop her, I was going to take her entire HOA office from her, legally and permanently. By the time dawn broke, I was already at my desk with a mug of black coffee, scrolling through the HOA's bylaws and cross-referencing state property codes. The master key system was supposed to be restricted to common areas, laundry rooms, pool gates, storage sheds, not private residences. What Karen had in her purse was a clear abuse of authority, and if she had commissioned duplicates for board use, she'd violated locksmith licensing laws, liability clauses in the HOA's insurance, and possibly even committed criminal trespass. I catalogued the video footage, timestamped it, and downloaded it to 3 separate drives in case she tried to delete or suppress it later. Then I drafted an email to the county clerk's office requesting public documents on the HOA's corporate filings. Karen thought she ran this community like her personal kingdom, but she never counted on someone like me knowing how to pull the strings hidden in plain sight. The more I dug, the uglier it got. The HOA had renewed its corporate status only once in the past 5 years, leaving gaps where their authority was technically void. Meeting minutes showed they had voted themselves emergency powers during unspecified safety concerns, but the quorum required by state law had never been met. The fine structure they used to hammer residents with penalties, like $50 for unauthorized porch furniture or $100 for grass longer than 3 inches, had been passed in one of those illegal sessions. And the kicker? Karen's husband's security company was listed as the vendor for key management, charging outrageous fees for duplicate fobs and replacement locks. It was a conflict of interest so blatant it almost felt like a parody. Still, I knew better than to show my hand too early. Karen was the type to double down when cornered, and I needed her overconfidence to keep leading her deeper into her own traps. I started small, filing a formal records inspection request under the nonprofit statutes, demanding access to financial statements, vendor contracts, and key control logs. Legally, they had to comply within a set number of days, but I knew she'd ignore it, and that refusal would give me the leverage I needed. In the meantime, I took the broken half of her master key, sealed it in an evidence bag, and quietly handed it to the sheriff's office with a copy of my footage. I didn't press charges yet, I simply asked them to hold it on record. That way, if Karen escalated, I could pull the trigger on a criminal case at the exact moment it would sting the most. Predictably, she struck back fast. By the next afternoon, a notice was taped to my door in bold red ink: violation, unapproved security devices. According to Karen's scribbled notes, my cameras and floodlights required architectural review approval, and failure to comply would result in escalating fines and a possible lien. I almost laughed reading it, because not only were my security measures completely legal under state law, but she had just put her retaliation in writing. I scanned the notice, filed it with the rest of my dossier, and drafted a polite, razor-sharp response citing the state's Homeowners Association Act, which preempted any HOA rule that restricted basic residential security. I copied every board member on the email and even CC'd the county's Consumer Protection Division. That's when the calls started. First from nervous neighbors who had heard whispers about Karen's midnight key stunt. They wanted to know if I had proof, if it was true, if she had tried it on anyone else's cabin. Then came the ones from residents who had been hit with absurd fines, like an elderly woman threatened over a bird feeder, or a young couple harassed for having their kayaks tied up on the shoreline. Each story fueled my fire and added witnesses to the growing mountain of evidence I was building. The community was restless, angry, and most importantly, ready for change. Karen must have sensed the tide shifting, because she tried a bold play. She called a special inspection at my cabin, giving me 24 hours notice. Her plan was obvious: show up with a clipboard, declare some violation, and slap me with a massive fine. What she didn't know was that I had already filed a preemptive restraining request with the county, blocking any unauthorized entry pending review of the master key incident. When she and her cronies arrived the next day, they found a deputy parked at the end of my drive, casually leaning on his cruiser and flipping through paperwork with my name on it. Karen's jaw nearly hit the ground when she realized her bluff had been neutralized before she even stepped onto my porch. But the real gem of that encounter was what slipped out of her own mouth. Frustrated and red-faced, she shouted something about having the right to inspect all cabins since we hold the insurance liability. The deputy raised an eyebrow and asked her to clarify, and that's when she admitted in front of half a dozen neighbors that she and her board had been using their so-called master keys for compliance spot checks. It was the confession I needed, admissible, witnessed, and recorded on the deputy's body cam. In one furious outburst, she had handed me the nail for her own coffin. The morning after Karen's failed stunt and her humiliating outburst in front of the deputy, I settled into a rhythm of quiet but relentless investigation, determined to build a case so solid that when I finally moved, the HOA board wouldn't just stumble, they would collapse under the weight of their own corruption. I began by combing through every scrap of paperwork I could legally obtain, starting with the county's public records office where dusty cabinets held plats, parcel maps, and easements dating back half a century. My cabin sat on land tied to an old deed with language that hadn't been updated since the 70s, and as I traced the legal descriptions, I realized that not only had Karen overstepped her authority with her key, but the very ground beneath the HOA office was entangled in a mess of easements that had never been cleared. It appeared the parcel housing their administrative office had been sold off decades ago with a stipulation that neighboring landowners retained rights of ingress and egress, meaning technically the HOA didn't even control its own parking lot without consent from certain adjoining owners. I circled my name on the list because, as fate would have it, my property boundaries extended just far enough to give me leverage over the easement rights. That discovery was the first major card in my hand, but I wasn't ready to play it yet. I filed a formal request for the HOA's corporate filings with the state, expecting Karen to stall, and sure enough, a week passed with no response. When I followed up, she sent me a curt email dripping with condescension, claiming the board had already provided all pertinent information during previous meetings and that any further requests were burdensome. I smiled as I read it, because under nonprofit law, her refusal wasn't just petty, it was a statutory violation, and every day she withheld those documents, the penalties stacked higher. I printed the email, slid it into my growing binder, and drove down to the Consumer Protection Division where a clerk stamped my complaint with a satisfying thunk that echoed like the first drumbeat of war. While I maneuvered on paper, Karen tried to hit me where she thought it would hurt most, my wallet. She mailed me a fine for obstructing common access, alleging my security cameras created a privacy hazard for board members when they walked near my cabin. It was such a ludicrous argument I almost wanted to frame the notice, but instead I prepared a formal appeal and requested a hearing under the HOA's own bylaws. I knew she would deny it, and when she did, I would appeal to the state's dispute resolution office, dragging her name into public records where it would stain forever. To sweeten the play, I began gathering affidavits from neighbors who had endured similar fines, one for wind chimes deemed audibly intrusive, another for a child's bike left momentarily in a driveway, and yet another for a seasonal wreath that supposedly violated uniformity standards. Each affidavit was signed, notarized, and attached to a growing packet that painted a picture of abuse so systematic it bordered on farce. Karen's arrogance made my work easier. Instead of backing down after her misstep with the master key, she doubled down with threats and intimidation. She called me one evening, her voice shrill and full of false authority, warning me that my behavior could result in a lien against my property. I let her ramble, recording every word, and when she finally paused, I simply asked her if she was aware that state law prohibited liens based on disputed fines until after judicial review. She sputtered, clearly unprepared for a resident who could quote statute back at her, and hung up on me. That recording joined the growing pile of evidence, each piece a brick in the fortress I was constructing around myself and a hammer aimed squarely at her kingdom. But Karen wasn't my only target. The other board members, though quieter, were complicit, and I needed to find cracks in their loyalty. I invited a few of them to coffee under the guise of seeking clarity on HOA policies. One older gentleman, clearly weary of Karen's antics, admitted that he had never even seen the financials Karen claimed to present. Another confessed that meetings often skipped quorum requirements because Karen insisted urgent business justified shortcuts. I thanked them politely, careful not to reveal my hand, and noted their discontent. These were potential allies, or at least neutral parties who would look the other way when the time came. The turning point in my investigation came when I requested copies of the vendor contracts for security and landscaping. Buried in the fine print was confirmation that Karen's husband's company had exclusive control over all key systems in the community, charging inflated rates for every service call. Even worse, invoices revealed duplicate charges for lock replacements that never occurred, padded with vague descriptions like urgent compliance adjustment. It was clear evidence of self-dealing, a conflict of interest that violated both state law and the HOA's own bylaws. With this in hand, I drafted a formal complaint to the County Inspector General, copying every board member so they could no longer claim ignorance. Karen's fury was immediate. She called an emergency board meeting, but in her haste, she failed to post the required public notice, rendering the meeting void. I showed up anyway, standing quietly at the back of the room while she ranted about rogue elements undermining the HOA. Her face turned red when she saw me taking notes, and she tried to eject me, but several neighbors intervened, insisting the meeting be conducted openly. The confrontation descended into chaos, with Karen slamming her gavel so hard the handle cracked, while residents shouted about fines, keys, and corruption. It was the first time her mask slipped in public, and once it cracked, she couldn't piece it back together. After that night, momentum shifted. Neighbors began stopping me in the street, whispering stories of Karen's abuses, handing me copies of violation letters, and offering to testify if needed. An elderly widow confided that she had paid nearly $1,000 in fines for unauthorized garden fixtures, money she couldn't afford. A young father revealed he had been threatened with foreclosure over unpaid dues that the board had misapplied despite proof of payment. Each testimony fueled the fire, and soon I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for an entire community that had been cowed into silence by Karen's reign of fear. Still, I knew the endgame required precision. My goal wasn't merely to expose her, it was to take the very office she ruled from, and that meant mastering the bylaws she twisted for her gain. I spent nights highlighting clauses, cross-referencing statutes, and mapping out scenarios. One clause in particular caught my eye. Any 10% of homeowners could call a special meeting to propose a recall election. With the stack of affidavits I had collected, I already had more than enough signatures to cross that threshold. All I needed was the right moment to unleash it, a moment when Karen was at her weakest and the board too fractured to resist. The day after I filed the recall petition, the entire community seemed to buzz with energy, as though the air itself carried whispers of rebellion against Karen's iron grip, and for the first time in years, residents walked with their heads high instead of ducking when Karen's SUV rolled down the street. I knew she wouldn't take it lying down, and sure enough, the very next morning my inbox exploded with a flurry of emails from the HOA office, each one accusing me of some new fabricated violation, from improper window coverings to unapproved exterior color scheme. a tactic so desperate and transparent it almost made me laugh. But the truth was, this was no longer about her petty fines. This was about a war of legitimacy, and I was winning because every move I made was rooted in law, procedure, and truth, while every move she made revealed her desperation and corruption. I prepared my counterattack by making copies of the recall petition, the signed affidavits, and the stack of evidence showing herself dealing with her husband's security company, and I distributed them discreetly to neighbors who had already shown support, urging them to share the documents quietly with others to build momentum before the special meeting. Word spread like wildfire, and soon even those who had once kept silent out of fear were openly asking me when Karen would finally be gone. Karen, sensing her empire slipping away, tried to control the narrative by calling a town hall meeting of her own, plastering notices on every mailbox claiming she would clarify misinformation being spread by a malicious resident. I showed up early, binder in hand, and sat in the second row while she strutted to the podium with that gavel she loved so much, clearly convinced she could shout her way back into power. She began with a dramatic speech about community values, unity, and safety, but when she tried to justify the master key system as essential for compliance, the crowd erupted in disbelief. One neighbor shouted that she had no right to enter private cabins, another demanded to know why her husband's company was profiting from the security contracts, and within minutes the meeting descended into chaos. Karen slammed the gavel so hard it splintered, but the sound only emphasized how little control she had left. When she pointed at me and accused me of fabricating lies, I calmly stood, opened my binder, and read aloud the statute requiring transparency in nonprofit records, followed by the line in the bylaws allowing homeowners to call a recall election with 10% support. The room fell into stunned silence, broken only by murmurs of approval from the residents. Karen's face twisted as she realized she was cornered in her own arena, and when I revealed that I had already filed the petition and the county clerk had accepted it, the crowd erupted in applause that drowned out every attempt she made to regain control. That night, the energy shifted completely. Neighbors who had once been divided by Karen's petty rules gathered on my porch with coffee and stories, uniting in their frustration and relief that someone had finally challenged her. An elderly widow tearfully thanked me for standing up to the board after years of feeling powerless, while a young couple offered to help campaign for new leadership once the recall election was scheduled. I listened to them all, taking notes, not as a power grab but as preparation to ensure that when the dust settled, the community would rebuild on transparency and fairness instead of fear. But even as I felt the swell of support, I knew Karen would not retreat without a fight, and sure enough, the very next day she tried a new tactic. She filed for a temporary restraining order against me, claiming harassment and intimidation. I received the notice taped to my cabin door, complete with her signature and a laundry list of absurd accusations, like me threatening board members with legal jargon and intentionally disrupting peaceful enjoyment by encouraging mob behavior. I almost burst out laughing, but I knew this was serious business because if she managed to manipulate the court, even temporarily, she could slow the recall process. I gathered my evidence, filed a response, and showed up to the hearing with the broken master key in its evidence bag, the deputy's body cam report, and copies of every retaliatory fine and threatening email she had sent. The judge barely let her finish her rambling accusations before asking her why she had a key to private residences and why multiple affidavits accused her of unauthorized entries. Karen's voice shook as she tried to explain it away as standard HOA procedure, and the judge leaned back, unimpressed, before dismissing her motion outright and warning her about abusing the court system. I walked out of that courtroom with a subtle smile, while Karen stormed off, muttering about conspiracies and betrayal. That defeat only fueled her paranoia, and she began lashing out even harder. Within days, she sent contractors to the community with orders to conduct compliance inspections on random properties, but residents had grown bold now and refused to let them in, citing her lack of authority. Some even called me directly, laughing as they described how they had closed their doors in Karen's face. One neighbor told me Karen had stood in his yard screaming about bylaws until the sheriff arrived and told her to leave. Each failure chipped away at her once unchallenged aura, and the more she tried to assert control, the more foolish she looked. At the same time, I quietly pushed the next stage of my plan. I knew the recall election would require a neutral location, but the HOA office was the usual meeting spot, and Karen controlled access to it. That was when I played the card I had held back from the start, the easement rights tied to the parcel housing the office. I filed a notice with the county asserting my rights to control ingress and egress during certain hours, backed by the original deed language, and sent a copy to the HOA attorney. Within 48 hours, I received confirmation that until the dispute was resolved, the office could not legally host HOA business without my consent. The board was forced to scramble for an alternate location, a humiliating blow that left Karen sputtering with rage. The recall election date was set, and as it approached, tension rippled through the community. Karen resorted to desperate measures, sending out glossy flyers warning that without her leadership property values would collapse, insurance premiums would skyrocket, and chaos would reign. But the residents were no longer buying her fearmongering. They saw through her lies, especially after I distributed copies of her husband's inflated invoices and proof of the duplicate charges. At one point, I overheard two neighbors at the general store laughing about how Karen's master key to the kingdom had turned into a skeleton key for her own downfall. When the night of the election finally arrived, the atmosphere was electric. Dozens of residents filled the hall we had secured through the county library, their faces lit with anticipation. Karen arrived late, clutching a stack of papers and glaring at me from across the room, but her usual aura of intimidation was gone, replaced by the nervous energy of someone about to lose everything. The days following the recall election were filled with a strange mix of celebration and uncertainty, as neighbors who had once been silent victims of Karen's tyranny began to taste freedom for the first time but weren't entirely sure what came next, and that was exactly where my careful preparation mattered most, because while Karen had been busy slinging fines and stumping through yards, I had been laying the groundwork not just for her removal but for a clean, legal transfer of power that would make it impossible for her to worm her way back in. I knew she wasn't finished, because people like her never simply accept defeat, and sure enough within 48 hours she filed an appeal with the State HOA Oversight Committee claiming the recall election was invalid due to procedural irregularities. It was a desperate move, and I was ready, because before she ever thought to raise that claim, I had already double-checked every line of the bylaws and cross-referenced them with the Nonprofit Corporate Code, ensuring every signature, every notice, every ballot counted was compliant down to the smallest detail. The appeal was destined to fail, but the real battle wasn't in her paperwork, it was in what came next, the control of the HOA office, the physical and symbolic fortress where Karen had held court for years. That office was more than just a building, it was the epicenter of her power, the place where she had slammed gavels, mailed fines, and plotted her invasions into private lives, and if she still held the keys to that office, she could still meddle, delay, and create chaos. What she didn't know was that her control of that office was built on sand, because my research into the property records had uncovered a time bomb waiting to go off. The HOA had never fully purchased the land their office sat on, instead leasing it under terms tied to easement rights dating back decades, and those easement rights intersected with my property in such a way that gave me veto power over access. I had filed the necessary documents with the county weeks earlier, quietly securing my claim, and now I was ready to use it. I sent a certified notice to the interim board and their attorney declaring that as of that week, access to the office would be restricted pending resolution of the easement dispute, which meant no legal business could be conducted inside until proper authorization was restored. The interim board didn't fight me because they understood my intentions, but Karen, when she caught wind of it, nearly exploded, sending out frantic emails calling me a squatter and warning residents that the community was under siege. Her panic only fueled my resolve, and I set about methodically tightening the noose. I met with the county clerk, who confirmed that the HOA's corporate renewal had lapsed again, technically dissolving their legal authority for a brief period until refiled. That gap was another weapon in my arsenal, because it meant Karen had presided over fines and enforcement during a time when the HOA legally didn't exist, opening her up to restitution claims from every homeowner she had targeted. Armed with that knowledge, I prepared a presentation for the upcoming community meeting, a presentation not in slides or flashy visuals but in hard facts, documents, and statutes that even Karen couldn't twist. The night of the meeting, the library hall was packed again, standing room only, with residents eager to see what the new chapter of our community would look like. Karen arrived late, flanked by two of her remaining loyalists, her face drawn tight with defiance, clutching a folder stuffed with papers. She clearly intended to derail the meeting by shouting about her appeal, but this time the crowd wasn't having it. When she tried to grab the podium, a chorus of voices rose to shut her down, and all eyes turned to me as I calmly walked to the front, set my thick binder on the table, and began laying out the evidence. I started with the master key incident, reminding everyone of the broken key and the deputy's report, then moved on to the padded invoices from her husband's company, showing how thousands of dollars had been siphoned off through duplicate charges. Gasps rippled through the audience as I laid down page after page of proof, and then I revealed the easement records, explaining how the office she had ruled from wasn't even secure under HOA control. Karen tried to shout me down, claiming I was misinterpreting the law, but this time I was ready for her interruptions. I pulled out the notarized statements from the county clerk and the surveyor who had confirmed the boundaries, waving them in the air for all to see. The audience erupted into applause, drowning out her protests, and for the first time, she seemed to realize her voice no longer carried any weight here. I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of fear, the dawning awareness that she wasn't just losing control but was being systematically dismantled. To drive the nail into the coffin, I ended with the revelation that during the HOA's lapse in corporate status, every fine she had issued, every loan she had threatened, was legally voidable, meaning she could face restitution claims personally if she tried to fight. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the shuffle of papers and the murmur of neighbors processing what they had just heard. Then came the shift. Residents began standing one by one, speaking out about the wrongs they had endured, from petty fines to threats of foreclosure, and demanding restitution. The interim board, caught between the weight of evidence and the will of the community, voted unanimously to suspend all enforcement actions until a full audit was conducted. That moment marked the official collapse of Karen's empire, but I wasn't done yet, because the office was still in play. I offered a solution: transfer the office operations to a temporary location while the easement issue was resolved, and in the meantime, I volunteered to manage access and records as a neutral custodian. It was a bold move, but the crowd backed it, and the board approved with little hesitation. Karen's face was a mask of fury, but she could do nothing as the decision was recorded and approved. Her last attempt to salvage dignity came when she stormed up to me afterward, jabbing a finger in my chest and hissing that I would regret stealing her life's work. I simply held up the broken half of her master key, still sealed in the evidence bag, and whispered that this little piece of brass was the only key she ever truly held, and it had failed her the moment she tried to use it. She recoiled, trembling, and stormed out into the night, leaving behind an office, a title, and a community that no longer feared her. In the following days, I worked with the interim board to organize the audit, combing through records, unearthing more evidence of mismanagement, and preparing restitution claims for the residents who had suffered under her regime. Neighbors began to rebuild trust, meeting not out of fear of fines but to plan community events, barbecues, and projects that had been neglected for years. The office, once a symbol of control, now sat dark and locked, its fate tied to the easement rights that I held in reserve like a trump card. For now, I was content to let it sit idle, a monument to Karen's fall, until the time came to claim it fully. The recall election had stripped Karen of her official title and the easement dispute had shut down her ability to wield the HOA office like a throne, but everyone knew the true battle was still ahead because Karen was not the kind of person to fade into the background. She was the type who clung to any shred of power with white knuckles and refused to let go even when the crowd had turned against her. And so the board scheduled a final open meeting to address the audit results and determine the future of the HOA office itself. The community hall was overflowing that night, neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, some standing in the back or spilling into the hallway, the air thick with anticipation and tension because this was the night when years of abuse, fines, and intimidation would be confronted head-on. I arrived early, binder under my arm as always, and quietly took a seat near the front, watching as residents chatted in hushed voices, some angry, some nervous,